So I want to stop here for a moment and just ask if there are any comments, questions, other details before we go into our discussion questions. Yeah, Roger, go ahead.
So it's almost, as you're talking about, whether the courts, the Sanhedrin, are almost like the Supreme Court. One of the interesting questions in the Supreme Court is about settled law. Once the rabbinic Talmud or court or anything settles the discussion, can it be later overridden by other rabbinic courts or interpretations, or is that it?
Well, it's tough to do, because there's definitely a sense that the older generations are more authoritative. They're closer to Moses, they're closer to Sinai. But occasionally you have to make rules that get around them. So for example, they were having a problem around the time of Rabbi Hillel, one of the first rabbis, with the Jubilee year. Remember, every 50 years, the debts were supposed to be forgiven. Well, who would want to loan money in year 49? So they were having a real problem with the poor not being able to get money in year 49 because nobody wanted to lend money that would be forgiven before it'd be paid back. So ultimately, Rabbi Hillel put out a takana, a rabbinic decree, that said all debts that were owed in year 49 get transferred to the court. So a debt to the court doesn't get canceled, a personal debt gets canceled. So the court would ultimately collect the money on behalf of the lender, and the poor don't get the loan relief they were supposed to get under the original law. But it was a workaround. They had to come up with a way to solve that problem. Or another example, the Torah says that a stubborn and rebellious child should be stoned to death. Now, if any of you have either had kids or been a child, you know that would mean the end of humanity, right? Because every child is stubborn and rebellious at some point. So what the rabbis did was they took that passage in Deuteronomy and they interpret and they interpret and they interpret and they interpret and they qualify and they give conditions and ultimately at the end of the rabbinic discussion, the rabbi objects, by these criteria, there never was a stubborn and rebellious child and there never will be. No one's ever going to qualify for this. And then one says, well, I saw one once and I sat in his grave. So it did happen once, but they can't go back and just cancel it. They can't go back and cross off that section of the Torah. It's there. So they have to interpret and work around it. So the later the generations go, like into the later Middle Ages, even into modern times, you can interpret and qualify and come up with circumstances, but you can't go back and just strike it out. It gets harder and harder to make those changes, I mean, look, if you wanted to be a textual originalist with the US Constitution, you could say the Supreme Court review is not part of the Constitution. The whole concept of the Supreme Court reviewing the constitutionality of laws was a fiat in the early 1800s. So, you could take it all away. You could put yourself out of a job. So in general, later generations of rabbis can interpret around the edges, but they can't necessarily go into the core issue. So here's one example of a hot issue in the modern Orthodox community. So divorce in traditional Jewish life has to be initiated by the husband. The wife cannot divorce the husband if he doesn't consent to the divorce. And so often you get women who are what are called agunot. They're bound women. They're stuck because they can't get on with their lives. And the husband is basically holding them up for money to be able to get a divorce. And it's a really difficult experience for them. But if they want to live an Orthodox Jewish lifestyle, they can't just get a civil divorce. They have to get a religious divorce. Well, the problem is that even modern Orthodox Jews can't change the halakha, the Jewish law, that much. But what they can do is use prenup agreements. So what they've started to do in more liberal modern Orthodox communities is when a young couple gets married, or even an older couple, they sign a prenup that says if one party refuses to give the divorce decree to the other one, and it can go either way, they will owe them $100 a day for every day they refuse to grant this religious divorce. So they can't cancel the system, but they can create a penalty based on a prenup that was actually upheld in New York State court as a valid condition, as a valid prenup setup that would motivate them to do the right thing and let the person get divorced and move on with their life. But they can't just go back and scratch that part of the law. They have to add to it or work around it. Hope that makes sense.
I assume that's like the phone wires and power wires around the
Yeah, the
Orthodox
Eruv
community.
defining a private space, exactly. It began as a courtyard where you'd have sort of a shared courtyard among different houses, and then extended that to the wire that surrounds neighborhoods or even longer spaces that allows you to carry certain things out of the house that you wouldn't otherwise be able to carry. Yeah, Rin.
Could they go ahead and, because it says, the man has to initiate the divorce, couldn't they just sort of redefine what exactly initiating means, that certain actions are such that you could not that you're sort of implying that you're not fulfilling the obligations of a good husband, and therefore you're implying the initiation of a divorce?
Wiser minds than mine have delved into this issue, and people who know more about halakha than anybody here have done this too. And the short answer is no.
Okay.
You have to make some kind of overt conscious statement. I mean, to actually divorce you have to say, you are divorced from me, you are divorced. You have to say it 3 times and put the document physically in her hand. She has to be there. So by the way, a woman can sometimes withhold the divorce by not showing up for the divorce proceeding. So, and that's occasionally the case where the woman won't allow the man to divorce her. It's more often the other way, but it can happen the reverse too. But it has to be conscious. It has to be self-aware. It has to be explicit, and it has to be physical, verbal. So, there's certain non-negotiables that they won't allow you to get on. There's a whole tractate, a whole section of the Talmud called Gitin about divorces that spells this out in great detail with all the commentaries and laws since then. All right, any other general questions? Okay, well, we'll take a look at our discussion questions and see how far we get. Let me spotlight and then share. Okay, and go full screen. There we go. All right. So first question, what were the major centers of Jewish life in this period and why there? The 2 major centers are Babylonia in the east and the Galilee in the north of Israel. And not Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's been destroyed. The Egyptian diaspora, as I mentioned, declined after the diaspora revolt around 115 to 117 of the Common Era. And Judea itself was demolished by both the Roman revolt and then the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132. And the Babylonian diaspora was very prosperous. The Galilee was initially a very important setting. It was the home of that Nasi, that patriarch, the prince who claimed descent from David. Ultimately, that declines and is canceled by the Christian Byzantine Empire around 420, 425 of the Common Era, and Babylonia becomes the dominant center. Both areas produce a Talmud, a collection of rabbinic teachings, but the Babylonian Talmud is the authoritative source. Next question, what are Halakha and Agada? How do they relate to the Hebrew Bible? And which of these modes might we be more comfortable with? So the Bible canon is closed about 90 of the Common Era, which inspires new relations to the text. So how would you define Halakha? Start with that one.
Could I ask one quick question?
Sure.
So why was the Babylonian Talmud more authoritative than the Palestinian Talmud?
Well, it was more thorough. That is, they had more time to get through more of the subjects. So it has a Gemara commentary on many more of the Mishnah sections than the Palestinian Talmud does.
Did they ever conflict?
Yeah, sometimes they have slight differences. There was some dialogue and interchange between the communities, but there are some cases where one would rule one way and one would rule the other. Not on what time Shabbat starts or like big issues, but sometimes small flavor issues. And they also will include different legends and stories and deeds of the rabbis and things like that. There's actually a 300-page book you can buy that's the Babylonian Talmud reference volume that just lists all the rabbis and when they lived and all the locations and what are the abbreviations they use in the text. And it's like the answer key to understand what's going on here, because you saw in those texts, it doesn't say when the rabbi lived or where he was from or who. And someone actually went through all the stories of that rabbi and made a collection of here's where this person was, as best we can know. Sometimes we can't know, but to do their best in terms of putting them in historical order, because the text won't tell you. Remember, it was Rabbi so-and-so heard from Rabbi so-and-so. Well, so I know which one's earlier, but I don't know, I don't know how much earlier they are. So it makes it more complicated to decide. But the Babylonian Talmud is the more authoritative source because it's more complete, because it was later. And ultimately, as we'll see next time, the headquarters of the major Islamic empires that will reinforce rabbinic authority are set in Mesopotamia, specifically in what becomes Baghdad, near Babylonia. And so when you're near the center of power, that becomes more authoritative. And the Palestinian Talmud was based on the prestige of the Nasi, the patriarch, whose office was abolished 200 years before the Babylonian Talmud was completed. So there's really a disjointed connection there. And there's even a semi-political head of that Eastern diaspora who's called the Resh Galuta, the head of the diaspora, who's like a replacement patriarch. But he governs in a triumvirate with the head of 2 rabbinic academies who are teaching the Babylonian Talmud. So the basis of his authority is that structure, and so the Babylonian becomes the more authority. They don't like disrespect the Palestinian Talmud; it's just not as important. Okay, so how would you define halakha?
Well, that's the written law, correct?
Well, it's the rabbinic law. It's the religious law.
The
So,
religious law.
right, the written Torah has laws in it and stories and other things, but the halakha is the Jewish religious law that's either derived from biblical law or part of this oral law, oral Torah from Moses on Sinai. That can be halakha too. And
Okay.
there's a great statement at one point in the Talmud that says, some halachot, some laws are like mountains hanging by a hair. Get the image? Like there's all these laws here that have a very tiny basis for truth in connection to the text. Like, for example, you will not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And the rabbis create all the laws of milk and meat and a lot of the dietary laws out of that one verse. It's like a mountain of laws hanging by a hair to the text. But it's still the halakha, it's still the law, it's still not optional. And actually the word halakha comes from the Hebrew word halach, which means to walk. Just like in Islam, Sharia is the path. Or Tao, the Tao is the path in Taoism. So the idea of having a path to walk. And halakha actually is just as encompassing as Sharia. It includes ritual law, it includes torts and damages, it includes contract law, it includes marriage and divorce, it includes personal status, purity law. It covers all of life. It's all encompassing. So when you say religious law, sometimes we think that only applies to religious things, but it's religious law and the source of its authority and the people who are authorized to decide. In fact, when a rabbi is ordained in a traditional setting, you ask 2 questions. Yoreh, can he teach? The answer is Yoreh, he can teach. Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, he can judge, because the rabbi is a dayan, he's a judge of halakha, of Jewish law. And your local rabbi is the Mara Da'atra, the master of the house who makes the rabbinic law decisions for your community. But you might have a higher rabbi or the yeshiva he came from. So you can sort of appeal up the chain if you don't like the decision they make, or if you have questions, or if they have questions and can't resolve the issue. You know, here's an example of a halakhic dispute that needed resolution at a higher level. A man went out on a trading journey on a ship. And 6 months later, someone comes back and says, oh yeah, I saw that ship sink in a storm. Well, they're never going to find the body. So the local community declares the wife to be a widow based on credible testimony that the ship went down in the storm. And so she goes on with her life. She remarries. She has some more kids. Guess who shows up 5 years later? It's a miracle. I landed on a desert island. I was saved by pirates or whatever. Well, now what do? There's no provision in Jewish law for polyandry, for multiple husbands. So how do you resolve the dilemma? Well, this is a case that might require some appeal up the chain, if only for the authority of someone else telling me what the law is. In the end, what they do is they actually declare both sets of her kids to be bastards because the parentage is somewhat uncertain. Not very nice. But in fact, some of these questions became so well known that a new body of literature was created called responsa literature, which are like
Rabbi,
which are like frequently asked questions. What we'd use today in a website. This is a question that's important enough that we should share this more broadly because it might apply to other communities. And so this body of rabbinic decisions was collected as what are called responsa literature, or in Hebrew, it's she'elot u'teshuvot, questions and answers. And that helps to expand the category of halakha even broader. Yes, Roger.
Susan and I, to your previous point, Susan and I have a very close friend who was vacationing with her husband in the Caribbean on kayaks. She stopped to change. He ended up lost at sea. True story. They called in the U.S. AWACS and everything else to find the guy. They never found him. She went back to her conservative congregation here in Chicago and wanted a memorial service. And they said if he was drowned in a lake where they know he was drowned, they would have a memorial service for him. But since he disappeared in the ocean, she was an abandoned woman. They would not ever give her a get. They would not have a memorial service for her. And as a result, she changed congregations. And now she's reformed. But that actually happened to a close friend of ours.
Yeah. So this is, again, the dilemma of the law says X, and the rabbis have decreed this is what it means. And there's only so much you can go. And conservative Judaism presents itself as a variety of halakha, even if they're more flexible in some circumstances. They'll let you drive on Shabbat, and other rulings are a little more flexible. In fact, conservative Jews, when they get married, they have a special provision they added to their ketubot, to their marriage agreements, that says both parties agree that the Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism can cancel this marriage. So it's allowing the rabbis to avoid the agunah, the bound woman situation in conservative Judaism because of that clause. Now the Orthodox world says that clause is garbage. They won't listen to it. But in the conservative world, they're still trying to follow halakha. So occasionally they get stuck in circumstances like that where there's just no way around it because later authorities can't just flat out cancel what was there before. Okay, so we had halakha on one side, and what's Agada? That's the legends. Sometimes that's midrash, which is interpreting biblical stories, or it's the stories of the sages and deeds that they did. And of course, the Agada assumes that Rabbinic Judaism is the way it's always been. So the Agada describes King David studying the Torah, and says that Abraham invented the morning service, and Isaac invented the afternoon service, and Jacob invented the evening service, they all fulfilled all the commandments. Abraham didn't quite know why he was eating matzah in the spring, but he ate matzah in the spring just like you were supposed to. So it's sort of an ahistorical view of culture. So which mode do we connect to? Well, if Agada's story, and somebody pointed in the chat box, is like fan fiction where you can take the characters and write your own stories on it, well, then maybe that's a little easier for us. And halakha, Jewish law, can feel either to be like nitpicking about what shoe you put on first, or somewhat irrelevant, about ritual purity laws, or really upsetting and vexing because the ancient authority is unquestionable and the more restrictive position often wins. But the flip side is, there's a lot that's really ethically valuable described in halakha, not all of it, but some of it. And also it's a record of Jewish practice. So I remember reading one section that said, are Jews allowed to go into a Roman bathhouse if there's a statue of Aphrodite in the bathhouse? Now, what's fascinating is the historical detail that Jews were going to Roman bathhouses. They weren't segregated in that way. They would be naked with non-Jewish men. And then the question was, when they put a statue of Aphrodite in there, does that change things? But again, it's the historical data that's really fascinating. It's a record of Jewish practice and belief and thought process. And, I find, even as a humanistic rabbi, my members are not following these laws, but they're fascinated to find out details like, what about a woman who's divorced? And what about drowning in a lake versus drowning in the ocean? And what about the kosher laws? And what about the Shabbat rules? They're just curious about the thought process. So sometimes reading these laws gets you into the thought process, and you hear the voices, it makes it interesting in a different way, even if not as directly relevant as some other teachings might be. And as I said, sometimes the ethical diamond in the rough is found, and it really is meaningful. Okay, the next question. What is the Mishnah? How does traditional Judaism see it? And what are its historical origins? So this is the idea of the oral Torah. That Moses received the oral Torah and handed it down by word of mouth to the men of the Great Assembly, who gave it down to the earliest rabbis, and so on, word of mouth, all the way down until around 200 of the Common Era, where it's written down into the Mishnah in those 6 sections. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the Mishnah really, what Jewish people find themselves doing is a whole variety of things that aren't particularly defined in the written Tanakh. So as a result, they say like, well, these things are still legit because this is what we do traditionally. So we're going to create an oral Torah, which covers all these practices that we're already doing and posit it back on Mount Sinai to give it legitimacy. Is that pretty much correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of post-dating or predating the check, so to speak. Claims an older heritage. I mean, there was a book that came out a couple years ago by a guy named A.J. Jacobs called The Year of Living Biblically or something like that, where he tries to live following just the laws written in the Bible. And the reality is that some of what he's doing would be recognizable to Jews and some of it would not be recognizable to Jews, because we've evolved since that written version. We have this oral Torah that's interpreted how to do things. Some things are the same, like not eating pork. Pigs are defined out in the Torah explicitly and in rabbinic law as well. But having separate sets of dishes for milk and meat, that's a rabbinic law, not an explicitly Torah law. And so that would be different. Or lighting Shabbat candles before you start the Sabbath, instead of letting the things expire and not having any candles lit during Shabbat. These are rabbinic innovations that define Jewish life now. You're right, it's not the same as what it was in the written Torah. And remember, the oral Torah is also a little bit of how to interpret the written Torah. The Mishnah by itself basically will list laws and not give citations. You'll notice it said the laws are 40 minus 1 and started giving all the categories for Shabbat. Didn't give you a citation, didn't quote the Bible anywhere for that. It's the Gemara, it's the commentary that later says, where do they get these categories and where do they get that number? And then it posits a reason why they picked that number. They're guessing. But the Mishnah doesn't need to do that because it was a standalone oral Torah, most likely. Okay, in the Talmud, what is the relationship between Mishnah and Gemara? How could the literary form of the Talmud be used to support secular humanistic Judaism? Well, as I mentioned, the Gemara is like the footnotes, the commentary to the Mishnah. You can think of it this way, like Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, Gemara plus Mishnah equals Talmud. The Gemara clarifies Mishnah laws, gives new circumstances, may cite a support text to help prove the Mishnah law. It records discussions. Sometimes it records variant opinions. Both the Mishnah and the Talmud are not codes of law that say, this is what you do. Half of the time they give you a discussion and you're not sure who wins. There's actually one section I found really useful. I think it was in Eruvin, where it says, when this rabbi and this rabbi disagree, Rabbi A wins. And when this rabbi and this rabbi disagree, Rabbi D wins. Like it actually gives you the answer key of who's authoritative in the different generations. But sometimes it's not so clear what the law is. And later commentators sometimes will resurrect that minority opinion. Think about in Supreme Court jurisdiction, you've got jurisprudence, you've got minority opinions that are preserved. Same is true in the Talmud. You've got these minority opinions that sometimes get chosen. For example, one rabbi said that chicken doesn't count as meat. He would have chicken with milk. It's described, an anecdote in the Talmud. But his is the minority opinion. It's not accepted. The majority decide that chicken meat looks enough like other meat that you can't distinguish the two, and you shouldn't have it with dairy. Number 5, in the Talmud reading from Bava Metzia, what's the fundamental issue and how is it decided? And what does this say about rabbinic perspectives on the role of God in human affairs? That's the story about the oven and the voice from heaven, and we don't listen to the voices. Well, the question is, who has the authority to rule? Is it the miracle workers? Or is it the rabbis who interpret things by majority rule? And the irony is, the rabbis win by claiming that their authority supersedes divine intervention based on a quote from the Revelation text. So it's not really a humanistic document in terms of we have the right because we're people. We have the right because you gave us the right, God. It's a different category there. Human authority is elevated, although it is based on divine revelation. And God also is somewhat distanced here. You know, he's watching the debate. He's maybe putting his thumb on the scale a little bit by trying to help Rabbi Eliezer, but in the end, Rabbi Eliezer loses. Now, there is a sort of postscript to that story. I didn't include it in the passage, where after this event, because Rabbi Eliezer would not listen to the majority, he's expelled from the house of study. And all the things that he declared to be pure are declared to be impure. And he's a persona non grata. And then the story goes on to describe the heartache that causes for the head of the Sanhedrin, who I believe his wife is the sister of this Rabbi Eliezer. And so it goes on in this sort of family drama here. So on one level, the rabbis exert their authority. On the other level, they're seen as, being overly zealous in enforcing this. And, sometimes you just have to draw a line and exert an authority, and you have to obey the legal authority, even if you think it's unjust. And that's how it works out in rabbinic life too. And finally, how did the Christianization of the Roman and Byzantine Empire change Jewish life? And do we still feel some of those effects today? Well, we talked about the compiling of the Palestinian Talmud. What is it like now for Jews living under a Christian empire?
Well, it's much more difficult, especially because Christian states have tended to not permit Jews to participate fully in a lot of activities within the state, and very often there's this feeling that in order, as we're progressing towards the millennium or whatever, Jews need to be Christianized in order to make that happen, or to help make that happen. So, but Jews. It may be much more of a Zionist reading all this stuff, about all the persecutions, and the reason is the Jews never have anybody to defend them. Basically, you get the occasional Polish princes or whatever that are using them as moneylenders, whatever, and they get protection there for a while, and then that falls apart. But there's never any. It's always it's a persecution thing all the way through after this.
And the irony is, in the Roman Empire, Jews were tolerated more so than Christians.
Yeah,
it's the Christians who were thrown to the lions. It wasn't the Jews that were thrown to the lions. Some Jews were kept as slaves, obviously, after the Great Revolts, but they were a tolerated minority in the Roman Empire, where Christianity was seen as subversive and problematic. And then when it ultimately subverts the empire, maybe they were right, and converts Constantine and it becomes a Christian empire, then it turns around and they at times persecute pagans, and at times persecute Jews, because Jews are the holdouts. It isn't really until, not Constantine, St. Augustine comes up with the concept of the Jews as witness, that a rationale is provided for Jews to continue to exist under Christendom in a miserable state, because the idea of Augustine is you can see the mistakes of rejecting Jesus by looking at the Jews around you and see how miserable they are. So there's a rationale for Jews to be around. They just can't be too successful. It's not a great position for Jews to be in, but they can survive, as opposed to being wiped out as the pagans were. Pagans were not tolerated under a Byzantine Christian empire, and ultimately paganism is stamped out on those territories. Other experiences that still echo today. Most of the world knows our Bible. They read about King David. They read about Moses, right? Now, they might not call him Moses our rabbi, as the rabbis did, but they still see him as a prophet. Even Islam sees Moses as a prophet and is familiar with some of the stories about him. Living as a minority in a culture that knows some of what you do is something that's still familiar with us today. We've occasionally had stories come out where people visit a Jewish temple and ask to find the altar, because they've read about the temple. And where do you sacrifice the animals? Because when they see temple, they think temple means temple, like temple as described in the Torah laws. So that's the blessing and the curse. It gives us currency such that Indiana Jones can go and try and find the Ark of the Covenant and it's not just a niche Jewish story. We all know about it. If he'd gone to try and find Rabbi Akiva's yarmulke, like that would not have made a broad interest story. But the Ark of the Covenant is a universal story because of the spread of Christianity, which is, again, a blessing and a curse. It makes us a target, but also it broadens familiarity with our culture and some of our ideas. Okay, any last comments, thoughts, questions? I got you out of here before 9 o'clock, which is not bad for all of Rabbinic Judaism and its thought, or at least up to let's say the formation of the Talmud around 600 of the Common Era.